I declared I'm leaving, and don't bother coming back, my wife retorted. Usually, I'd respond with a harsh remark, but today, I chose a more civilized farewell. We've exchanged similar words over our 14-year marriage, but this time, I won't return after a few days. She'll understand my intentions. Over the past 6 months, my wife, Jenna, has become increasingly verbally abusive. I couldn't comprehend why her hurtful words stung so much that I started avoiding her. I began spending more time in the car or returning home after Jenna and our 13-year-old daughter, Carrie, finished dinner. I needed to take care of myself. Sometimes, there were leftovers, but lately, they've disappeared before I return. I'm known as Kurt Kaminski, although my full name is David Kurt Kaminski. My father is also named David, so I was called Kurt from birth to avoid confusion. I'm of Polish descent, or more accurately, an American with Polish roots. I've heard all the jokes, and new ones seem to appear every year. As the only Pole I know in this town of 10 million people, I often become the punchline. Technically, I'm half Polish, but since I'm a Kaminski, I'm considered Polish. 4 weeks ago, I discovered that my soon-to-be ex-wife isn't who I thought she was. I had been avoiding her due to her verbal abuse, but one Monday evening, I overheard a conversation at a diner that changed everything. I was about to order when I heard 2 men discussing a woman named Paula. I tuned in and heard one of them say, "I've been with Paula since they got married. I even bet on their wedding day, and he's clueless." The second voice was my best friend, George Carey. I froze as they continued talking, but I couldn't hear anything else until George said, "We meet at least twice a month. Kurt's so clueless, he doesn't suspect a thing." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife, Jenna, had been having an affair with my closest friend, George, who was also my trusted mechanic. I wanted to hire him as my staff mechanic, but he joked about not respecting himself if he worked for a Pole. I sensed he was serious, so I hired him as an independent contractor. He was my sole source of income, and that would be his downfall. I left the diner, doubting what I had heard. Was it true, or was George just boasting? They might have hired a private investigator, but if what he said was true, their meetings were infrequent, and it might be a waste of money to investigate. However, I decided to check Jenna's phone and email when I got home. She was her usual self, which was fine with me. I needed to know the truth before confronting her. When she fell asleep, I checked her email, which was clean. Her phone was locked, but I quickly cracked the password using our daughter's birth date. I found a few suspicious messages, but nothing from George. His name in her contacts wasn't unusual since he was my friend. I started to think that maybe he was just talking trash. I went to bed, feeling restless. It was past 2:43 a.m. when I finally fell asleep. The next day, George made some Polish jokes at the dealership where I work. I usually let them slide, but this time, I snapped at him. He stared at me, lost for words, knowing that I was onto something. I retreated to my office and considered how to gather evidence against them. Confronting them directly wouldn't work, they would deny it. I needed solid proof. I called a private investigator in Santa Fe and explained my situation. He suggested monitoring their meetings, but it would be expensive due to their infrequent encounters. Alternatively, I could install a tracker on Jenna's phone or set up cameras at home. However, if she noticed the devices, she would likely catch on. The investigator recommended a tracking program, which he offered for free, saying that the information was available online anyway. He suggested that I tag her phone and hope to catch them in the act. That night, I installed the tracking software on Jenna's phone and synced it with mine. It would run in the background without her knowledge. Finally, I could sleep soundly. The next day, I kept an eye on the app. Jenna worked part-time at the university bookstore, and George was home most of the day. Whenever Jenna was at work, George was out working, so it seemed that nothing had happened that day. That evening, I tried to be more civil with Jenna and Carrie. I suggested that we go out for dinner, and Jenna seemed somewhat responsive. Carrie, being a typical teenager, hesitated, but I insisted. During dinner, I casually brought up George, and Jenna shifted uncomfortably before quickly changing the subject. My suspicions were confirmed. I needed to find out if George's claims were true. I decided to check Jenna's phone again that night, but I couldn't find any calls or texts from George. Either she was deleting them quickly or not making any at all. I climbed into bed, feeling conflicted about being intimate with Jenna if she had been unfaithful. I resolved to let her take the lead until I had solid evidence. We did end up being intimate, but it was unremarkable. Throughout the week, I kept track of Jenna's phone, but nothing unusual happened. On Saturday night, while she slept, I checked her phone again but found nothing. I began to think that George was just boasting, as he had done in the past. However, my subconscious wouldn't let me rest. At 2 a.m., I decided to go downstairs for a drink to help me relax. As I sat with a glass of Jack Daniels and Coke in one hand and Jenna's phone in the other, I decided to check it one more time. I entered the password, our daughter's birthdate, and opened the phone to the home screen. Suddenly, it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Our daughter's birthdate was the key. Jenna had a difficult pregnancy, and we had feared losing our baby several times due to complications with her Rh factor. Jenna spent the last 3 weeks of her pregnancy on bed rest to ensure the baby's safe delivery. Carrie was born exactly 9 months after our wedding. I remembered that Carrie was born 9 months after our wedding, which made her a wedding night baby. If George's claims were true, there was a strong chance that Jenna was already pregnant before our wedding night. Jenna was on the pill, but the doctor speculated that the stress of the wedding might have interfered with her hormones, making the pills ineffective. If the pills failed that night, they might have failed that day too. I knew what I had to do. There was a 50-50 chance that I was not Carrie's biological father. I got off the couch and headed to the bathroom, where I found some cotton swabs. Carrie was fast asleep in her room, finally settling into a good sleep routine at 4 years old. I gently swabbed the inside of her cheek with a Q-tip and sealed it in a plastic bag. I repeated the process for myself. Even if Carrie was my biological daughter, there were still questions about Jenna's faithfulness. The next day, I took the samples to Western New Mexico University and spoke with someone in the science department. They directed me to the department head, who welcomed the opportunity to help. I handed over some business cards and offered a 10% discount to anyone working on the samples. He seemed appreciative and mentioned that he was considering buying a new car. I spent the day avoiding Jenna and Carrie, trying to keep my emotions in check. I was anxious to confirm my suspicions, but I was also plagued by doubt. Jenna asked if something was on my mind, and I replied that I was planning to buy a bunch of cars at the next auction to stock up the lot. Money might be tight until I made some sales, but it was a necessary expense. Jenna advised me not to overextend myself, referring to the business as ours even though it was really mine. I decided to pay off the credit cards and keep only one open to improve our credit. It was a tactic to mask my strategy in case Jenna found out about it later. I also considered setting up the business as a separate entity to protect my personal finances. Living in a religious community, I didn't want business decisions to affect my personal life negatively. Bright and early Monday, I took the samples to the university and spoke with the department head again. He welcomed the opportunity to help and mentioned that he was still considering buying a new car. I assured him that I would offer a 10% discount to anyone working on the samples and handed over some business cards. He seemed appreciative and said that he might swing by the dealership to check out the selection. As I left the university, I knew that the test results could spell the end of my marriage. When I mentioned buying new cars to Jenna, it was merely a cover-up for my troubled thoughts. However, the idea started to grow on me. I summoned my accountant, loan officer, and occasional salesperson into my office and shared my plans. We discussed the next moves for both the car purchases and paying off the mortgage on my house. I also considered contacting my lawyer for a family law referral, but I hesitated. I needed to see the DNA test results first before taking any further action. I had yet to find concrete evidence of Jenna's infidelity, and I didn't want to accuse her without proof. Late Wednesday evening, the department head called and confirmed the test results. He arranged to visit me the next day to discuss the car purchase. When he arrived, he handed over the envelope with the results. I glanced at them and nodded, even though the news hit me hard. He gave me a moment before discussing the car purchase. I assured him that I would offer a 10% discount to anyone working on the samples and handed over some business cards. He seemed appreciative and mentioned that he was still considering buying a new car. After he left, I pondered my next move. The DNA test results confirmed that Carrie was not my biological daughter. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, and sadness. I wondered how Jenna could have done this to me, and how George could have betrayed our friendship. I knew that I had to confront them both, but I needed a plan. I decided to consult with a local auction dealer to identify someone skilled and dependable to inspect the cars before shipping them to our small town. I also needed to keep the car purchases under wraps until the last minute to avoid any suspicion from Jenna or George. I didn't want them to know that I was planning to expand the business and potentially increase my wealth. Arriving in Albuquerque around 9 a.m., I checked into a Best Western hotel. Despite being the owner of the dealership, I couldn't justify splurging on an expensive hotel using company funds. The room was comfortable, and the bed was just what I needed. I'm a simple person with simple needs. Upon entering the room, I immediately checked Jenna's phone tracker and discovered that she was still at home, or at least her phone was. Sleep proved elusive that night as I couldn't shake off thoughts about her actions and motivations. How could she justify her affair, especially on our wedding day, and continue it for who knows how long? I started to reassess our marriage, which was never perfect but built on the foundation of exclusive love. In the initial years following the wedding, things weren't smooth sailing. We didn't anticipate a baby right away, but Carrie's arrival disrupted our plans. Learning that my best friend was the cause of this disruption made all the struggles seem futile. George shattered my life when he seduced my future wife on our wedding day, and now he entertains her at least twice a month, all the while likely mocking me, the oblivious Pole. Anger simmered within me once more. I needed to regain composure or risk a sleepless night. I turned on the TV to watch a mindless comedy show, and laughter helped soothe my nerves. By 11 p.m., I was ready to doze off, looking ahead to a busy day at the auction. The auction went smoothly, and I snagged some excellent cars at favorable prices. I networked with dealers in the Albuquerque area and spotted no Miatas at the auction. However, I inquired with other dealers and found two potential deals, a red Miata and a black Miata. I negotiated potential deals pending confirmation of my client's preferred color, and both dealers agreed to handle the transaction once I provided details of the cars on my lot. Later in the afternoon, during my meeting with the lawyer, the news wasn't encouraging. I faced losing half of my assets along with alimony and child support payments for a child who wasn't even mine. In that moment, I decided against pursuing a divorce. Instead, I resolved to leave Jenna with George's child, paying off the mortgage on the house so she could remain there. However, with only my name on the mortgage, she wouldn't be able to sell it. By continuing to cover taxes and utilities while living elsewhere, she wouldn't have the option to resign and claim the house. Arriving home utterly exhausted from a demanding day, I informed Jenna of my fatigue. I headed straight to the bedroom, wanting nothing more than to shower and sleep. Jenna asked if I wanted dinner, but I declined, saying that I had a late lunch. At least she cared enough to ask. The shower was blissful, almost like my troubles were washing away. While problems persisted, I found solace in devising solutions. Minutes after my head hit the pillow, sleep enveloped me. The past week had been stressful, but with a plan in motion, I finally found mental reprieve. Rising early feeling rejuvenated, I headed to the office before Jenna and Carrie stirred. Amid spreadsheets and financial reports, I orchestrated my next moves. I briefed my team on the 23 car purchases and instructed them to cease assigning work to George, emphasizing the need for secrecy. I also phoned my business lawyer, seeking advice on protecting my assets. "Your business is registered, but she might still force a sale to claim half its value," my lawyer suggested. I couldn't sell the business, it was my life. I retorted, letting the news hit hard. I'd poured sweat and tears into building my business, akin to raising a child. Unlike Carrie, I thought bitterly, rage threatening to consume me again. As a seasoned businessman, I knew to compartmentalize. I refocused on my business agenda, first contacting Doug, who confirmed George's claims. We discussed the Miata's color and price, and I assured him that I would find a suitable deal. Meanwhile, George showed up with several cars still awaiting repairs, unaware of my simmering anger toward him. Overhearing salesmen discussing the impending arrival of 23 cars, George inquired about the schedule. I informed him that the auction house would handle the delivery likely late next week or early the following week. Struggling to keep calm in the presence of this betrayer, I managed to chuckle as he departed. That weekend, I distanced myself from Jenna, occupying myself with yard work and errands. Checking her phone tracker no longer concerned me, I harbored only contempt for her. Raising another man's child felt unforgivable. Monday found me back at the car show, where I arranged to trade the BMW for the Miata. I set off to Albuquerque to finalize the deal, informing my team of my day-long absence. The journey and lunch were pleasant, forging a new camaraderie with the dealer. Driving back in the Miata, wind tousling my hair, I relished the freedom. Soon, I pulled into our driveway in a fiery red sports car. Jenna glanced out the window and exchanged words with Carrie, prompting them both to step outside to observe. Jenna remarked patronizingly that we needed something with a back seat for Carrie, and she wasn't a fan of small cars. Carrie, when I called for her to join us, refused, saying that she didn't want to be seen with a Polish used car salesman. Her words stung, typical of a teenager's bluntness. I was taken aback by the disrespect, glancing at Jenna, who seemed to treat Carrie's remark as inconsequential. Now both the women in my house were showing disrespect, making me question the authenticity of my family life. Shifting the car into reverse, I drove off, fueled by frustration. I navigated the roads of Silver City until I returned home around 9:30 p.m. Heading straight upstairs, I took a quick shower and crawled into bed. When Jenna entered the room, casting a bright light into my eyes, she chided me for sulking and not spending time with my family. Her sudden attitude shift puzzled me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it stemmed from George's influence. The atmosphere in the Kaminsky household grew cold and silent over the following days. I contacted Doug, who came over to inspect the Miata and was thrilled with it. After discussing the numbers, he received a great deal, $3,000 less than Kelly Blue Book. As he finished the paperwork, he mentioned that his best friend handles purchasing for the university and rotates about 16 cars every 2 years. I assured him that I would ensure his friend gets a good deal. On Wednesday, my lawyer called with a potential solution to my problem. I met with him later that day and heard the plan, which would take about 2 weeks to execute. Over those 2 weeks, I gradually moved personal items and tools from my house to an apartment nearby. Meanwhile, George awaited the arrival of the 24 cars to do some work, but I kept delaying him. During the past weekend, I did some yard work and cleared out my closet and drawers. Jenna did laundry during the week, so she didn't notice the emptiness of my closet. This brings me back to that Monday night when I told Jenna I was leaving. She once again showed rudeness and disrespect, targeting me for being Polish and a used car salesman. The following Tuesday morning, I arrived at the parking lot early and gathered my employees in the conference room. It was a regular weekly meeting, so nothing seemed unusual. I began by informing them that the cars I purchased a couple of weeks ago had arrived and were ready for sale. We wouldn't be using George for any more work at the dealership. I paused, wiping a tear, and continued, saying that I had sold the business. They looked surprised, but nothing changed regarding their roles, except for my assistant Anna, who would take on some of my duties and receive a corresponding raise. Despite their astonishment, they began congratulating Anna, recognizing her hard work and worthiness. After the meeting, as we exited the conference room, George stood there, asking why he wasn't included. I explained that it was for staff only, and he was not an employee. He seemed taken aback, but I informed him that the cars had already been prepared for sale. He protested, saying that he always checked the cars, but I held my ground. I told him that I had sold the business, and the new owner wanted to go in a different direction. He exclaimed, making it about himself, and I held back my anger. I kept it brief, realizing that sometimes less is more. "I can't believe you sold the business," he said, and I replied that he could pick up his check for the past 2 weeks' work. It wasn't much, as Anna rarely utilized his services. When I spoke with Anna, I asked her to keep our conversation confidential. I explained that I had set up companies registered in Nevada. One bought the parking lot, and the other bought the company. I owned all the shares in both, and eventually, I would divorce Jenna, ensuring she didn't get the business. I moved out, and Jenna didn't know yet, but I wasn't going back. She had an affair with George, and Carrie wasn't my daughter. I suspected she was George's. I didn't know if Jenna knew, let alone George, but they would find out soon. I wouldn't divorce Jenna immediately, but I would keep paying utilities and taxes for our house so she couldn't claim abandonment and take everything. If she filed for divorce, I didn't want her to take over the business. That's why I agreed to the company being bought twice, letting them figure it out. The proceeds would be spent by the time she got the divorce done, plus I barely made anything from consulting and a few commissions. Anna could handle daily operations, and I would be available for questions but trusted her judgment. I had one more task for her before I left, to order a new sign and letterhead for the business. We were changing the business name to Helpless Car, reinforcing the idea to George and Jenna that the business was under new ownership. I bid farewell to everyone and headed out. I got into my Audi and drove towards Albuquerque. About 2 hours later, I received a call from Jenna. I hadn't expected her to call so soon, but this was a familiar pattern. I decided to answer the call, curious to hear what she would say this time. She asked what was going on, and I replied that I was heading to Albuquerque. She inquired why, and I stated that I was picking up a car. She revealed that George had called and said that I sold the business. I responded that it was my company, and I could sell it whenever I wanted. I hoped the new owner would treat my former employees well. Jenna worried about the mortgage, but I assured her that I used the money to pay off the house. She only needed to worry about utilities and taxes now. She panicked, asking about food, gas, and insurance. I suggested that she could work more hours to cover those expenses. When she asked when I was coming home, I said that I wouldn't return. I reminded her of what she said when I left that evening and assured her that I would figure out how to cover the bills. She pleaded with me to come back, but I responded impassively, saying that I really didn't want to. She tried to appeal to my emotions, mentioning our daughter, Carrie. I retorted that Carrie was just a 13-year-old girl, and I couldn't take her words to heart. Jenna tried to call me back several times, but I didn't answer. I knew she would try to contact her lover for more information and to relay what I had said. Upon reaching my destination, I switched my phone back on and noticed 5 missed messages. 3 were from Jenna, 1 from George, and 1 from Anna. I immediately dialed Anna, who informed me that Jenna and George had called her to find out where I was. She told them that I didn't own the place anymore and wouldn't be coming back. I thanked Anna for her support and assured her that she and the rest of my team were like family to me. She told me that her husband realized how lucky he was to have her, and I promised that I wouldn't take that for granted. I decided not to call Jenna or George, letting them stew in their own thoughts. Over the next 2 weeks, I journeyed through northern New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. I stayed close in case Anna needed me, and I checked in with her a few times. Once things seemed settled, I headed west. They kept calling, first with annoyance, then apologies, and finally hints of resentment. I listened but shrugged it off. When they reported my cancelled credit card, I chuckled. George even called me a villain for leaving Jenna and Carrie, and I chuckled some more. My lawyer texted me that Jenna threatened legal action if I didn't return, but I assured him that she wouldn't be able to prove anything. I had a recording of our conversation where she insisted that I didn't come back, and it was gold. As I roamed the Southwest, I caught glances and even a few flashes from middle-aged women. But I wasn't seeking that. I was still married, no matter what. I drove to Reno, then Lake Tahoe, the coast, Napa Valley, and zigzagged along Highway 1. I visited Yosemite, San Diego, Death Valley, Las Vegas, and Phoenix. There was no rush, and I chatted with folks in parking lots, enjoying the freedom of the open road. After approximately 3 months and covering 8,000 miles, I decided to head back to Silver City. Upon arrival at Helpless Auto, I was warmly welcomed by my entire team, including a few new faces. They all expressed joy at my return, and I treated everyone to food and drinks at Wrangler's, where we enjoyed a fantastic dinner and caught up with each other. As the evening wound down, only Anna and I remained. She gazed at me and said that I might feel powerless and lost, but I was mistaken. I simply placed trust in those I loved. She had figured out the meaning behind the new name, Helpless Car, and thanked me for trusting her with the responsibility. I told her that she hadn't filled my shoes, she had forged her own path. We embraced, and then she departed to her husband, who appeared genuinely content. I headed back to the apartment I hadn't visited in 3 months. The air was stale, so I opened the windows to let in the refreshing evening breeze. I grabbed a beer and settled on the terrace, overlooking the pool. Several people were swimming, and a family was enjoying themselves nearby. My mind drifted to Jenna and me, and I realized that our lofty aspirations and dreams had vanished. It was time for a confrontation, so I rose and hopped into my Miata, driving to my house, which was technically still mine since I purchased it before marrying Jenna. Disappointment washed over me as I pulled into the driveway. The yard was unkempt, and the landscaping had been neglected. The porch light was on, indicating that Jenna was likely home. I approached the door and knocked, and Carrie answered, greeting me with a surprised look. I asked if her mom was home, and she stuttered before yelling for Jenna. Jenna appeared from around the corner, spotting me, and shrieked. I responded calmly, saying that I had been traveling. Just then, George emerged from the bedroom in his underwear, and I remarked that the whole family was there, mom, dad, and child. Jenna retorted, asking what I was talking about. I explained that George had stepped in to fill my role, and it was rightfully his. Jenna looked puzzled, and Carrie's tone turned visibly enraged. I clarified that George never worked for me by his own choice, so I couldn't have fired him. Regarding bills, all utilities and car insurance were covered, and Jenna had a job to cover expenses while I was away. Jenna challenged me, saying that I couldn't just waltz back in and take over. I assured her that I would wait until she and her partner found somewhere else to live. It was clear that they were staying together in my house, and Carrie seemed fine with it. Jenna retorted that she wasn't leaving her home, but I corrected her, saying that it was my home. I explained that I had purchased the house before we married, and only my name was on the deed. Jenna insisted that it was her home now, but I asserted that I was the legal owner, even though I had been away briefly. I told her that she had until the end of next month to find a new place and to take her daughter with her. I disclosed to Carrie that I knew she disliked being called Polish, and I had some news for her. Her real father wasn't me, it was George. Silence enveloped the room, and after a moment, Jenna whispered, "What?" I confirmed that Jenna's carelessness on our wedding day had resulted in a child, but not mine. I told Carrie that she could now take her real father's last name and become Carrie. I wondered aloud if Jenna had chosen the name Carrie out of respect for her lover. Jenna and George exchanged looks, and the color drained from his face. I handed them the DNA report, telling them to see for themselves. I instructed Carrie to inform the lovebirds that her mom would be served with divorce papers next week, along with an eviction notice. I walked away, leaving them to process the news. Throughout my absence, I couldn't shake the thought of whether this affair had been ongoing during our marriage. Did Jenna choose me, or was I just a pawn? I felt utterly helpless, ignorant, and vulnerable. George had mocked me behind my back and cracked Polish jokes to my face. Back at the apartment, I drowned my thoughts in beer. The next morning, I visited the lawyer to initiate the paperwork for the divorce. I knew that I would have to sell the house and split the proceeds, but being a barely working person meant that I wouldn't owe alimony or child support, especially with another man in my place. The betrayal by Jenna and George was devastating, and rebuilding trust, whether with a man or woman, would be a daunting task. I considered therapy as the divorce proceedings commenced. I returned to work at the dealership, emphasizing to my colleagues that I was no longer the boss and only needed one sale per week to cover my expenses. I even insisted on just one when faced with court-ordered child support. I ensured that my bank accounts were emptied, leaving only enough for my basic needs. At month's end, Jenna hired a lawyer, although I questioned how she could afford one. They scrutinized my accounts in the sale itself but failed to uncover anything substantial. I learned from my colleagues that during my absence, George visited the dealership almost daily for the first 2 weeks, trying to secure work from Anna. However, she consistently turned him down, and he eventually gave up. Now, he regretted not obtaining his ASC certification, and his only job prospect was at Valine, doing quick oil changes for $13 an hour. I hoped that Jenna would work full-time, or they would struggle financially. I contacted the realtor and notified Jenna that I was listing the house for sale, anticipating a 50-50 split of our assets. Since she had already received an eviction notice, she needed to vacate before the sale closed. One evening, Jenna knocked on my door, and I reluctantly let her in. She asked if we could talk, and I agreed, suggesting that we go to Denny's, where there would be witnesses. After exchanging pleasantries, I asked her why she had cheated on me with George. Jenna hesitated before admitting that she had liked both of us and couldn't choose. George had warned her not to tell me about their affair because it would ruin our relationship. I probed further, asking why she had said yes when I proposed. Jenna replied that she loved me and George, but she knew that he wouldn't make a good husband. She ended things with him when I proposed, and we focused on our wedding plans. However, on our wedding day, she was with George. I pressed her for more details, and Jenna started crying, admitting that everything was a mess. She didn't want to lose George, and he didn't want to lose her. I remarked that now they had each other and their child, Carrie. Jenna looked at me and said that she still loved me. I told her that it was nice to hear, but I wasn't sure she understood what love truly meant. Before she left, I had to ask one final question: had they ever stopped seeing each other? Jenna hesitated before admitting that they never ceased their affair. They had quiet times, but they typically met twice a month. I thanked her for her honesty, and we went our separate ways. 4 months later, we stood before a judge and finalized our divorce. George was present too. Exiting the courthouse, Jenna suggested that we grab a drink, and I agreed, despite the previous animosity. I knew that this marked the end of my association with them, and they could now be together. I settled the bill, and we headed to our cars. I knew that Jenna would have to adjust to a lower standard of living, but I couldn't bring myself to care. After all, she had chosen this path, and she deserved the consequences.